Okay, guys, so we're going to begin now learning about the integration of information in the brain and the spinal cord. And we're going to begin with the spinal cord before the brain. So the spinal cord cannot be the spinal cord cannot be studied in isolation from the nerves that connect us to the particular spinal cord. So we have learned in the past that we have an integration center. This integration center is going to internalize information and process, integrate that information, and then an output, generate an output. So we need a integrated integration center. This integration center is important for this integration center is important for integrating the information, for control, and for processing of the information. And we said that the integration center is either the brain and it's either the spinal cord. And we said that this entire part here of this integration center, that is known as your CNS, that is your central nervous system. And when you get an input signal that will be processed in the control center and integrated, this input signal is carried by an afferent neuron and bringing in a sensory information from a receptor. So you have a receptor who's going to detect some thermal change, some chemical change, some pressure change, and that's going to lead to an input that will be processed, and then we will generate an output to an effector, who will do the output. So we'll have an output that's going to the effector, meaning we have efferent neurons, and the output is going to be motor because the input was sensory. So we said that this whole division here, responsible for integration of information, that is known as the central nervous system, while all these nerves, these tracts that bring in and carry out information is known as the PNS, the peripheral nervous system. So the job of the spinal cord is for conduction and for neural integration, for movement, and for the reflexes. So there are nerve fibers that conduct sensory and motor information up and down the spinal cord. These nerve fibers, they bring in input from your somatic and your visceral organs to this control and integration center for processing, and then an output is going to be generated. So there is neural integration. Neural integration is the process of the control and the processing and the integration where you would have interneurons. These spinal neurons would receive the input from multiple sources, integrate it, and then execute the appropriate output, like bladder control. What happens is your bladder will get distended with urine, and the urine will start to press on the walls of the bladder. Then the bladder is you're going to have stretch receptors. So the stretch receptors are going to sense the stretch receptors are going to sense the compression of the urine fluid against the walls of your bladder. So this is the type of stretch. This is the type of stretch receptor. The stretch is going to be a sensory stretch signal that is going to be an afferent input into the central nervous system. Then the central nervous system is going to generate an output that is motor, efferent, and is going to cause the voiding urinary voiding reflex. And the spinal cord is also important for locomotion. Locomotion is when the spinal cord contains central pattern generators, and these are groups of neurons that coordinate the repetitive uh, sequence of contractions for walking. So the ability to walk, that is a specialized way in which particularly your spinal cord, not your brain, is responsible to integrate interneurons who will give in an input that is associated with your brain and your desire to walk, and that is a center known as the locomotion for movement, locomotion and taxiing. And lastly, there are these involuntary movements. So there are involuntary responses to the stimuli that are vital to the posture and the coordination for survival, for protection and survival. So when we look at the structure of the spinal cord, we see that it is a cylinder of nervous tissue that arises from the brainstem at the foramen magnum. So this very important foramen magnum is the outlet. It's a bone. The foramen magnum is a bone tissue that is like a hole, and the spinal cord begins right below. So you would have your pons, you'd have your pons, then you would have your a bulge here, then the spinal cord is going to form. So this whole region, this is your foramen magnum, this is the foramen magnum through which your spinal cord would descend. This is the spinal cord, and this is the pons. What is this region between the pons and the spinal cord? What is the region between the pons and the spinal cord? That is your medulla oblongata. Very good. And the medulla oblongata and the pons and the diencephalon make for us a collection. This is not a one organ, but it's rather a collection of organs. You know, when we say the immune system is not a one organ. It is a collection of these cells, these cytotoxic T cells, the B lymphocytes, and you have your generalized immunity cells. These are not particular organ. So you have your brain stem. The brain stem is not an organ. The brainstem is a collection of very important organs, including the pons, the medulla, and the diencephalon. So they can never point to one organ and tell you what is that? Is that the brainstem? Because it's not a one organ; it's a collection of organs. So it's very important to see that you have your pons. Below them is your medulla. Below that is the foramen magnum through which your spinal cord would descend. And here you have what do you have here? What is this called? What is this structure? That is your cerebellum. That is your cerebellum. And then what is this structure called? This is your corpus callosum. This is the corpus callosum. And on top of everything, you have 80% of your brain, and that is known as the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is the outer layer. This is the cerebrum. And then you have your corpus callosum. And then you have your cerebellum. And then below that is the pons, medulla oblongata, and then the foramen magnum, this bony cavity through which your spinal cord is going to descend. So what's interesting about the spinal cord is that it occupies 2/3 of the vertebral column. So there is no spinal cord tissue down in your sacrum and in your coccyx. It ends about lumbar 1. For younger children and the very young, the spinal cord descends down to level lumbar 3. But as you grow up, it shortens up. It gets smaller and it ends at L1. Below that, L2, L3, L4, L5 is empty. There's no spinal cord in there. So nobody is having a disc herniation at level L4 or L3 because there's no spinal cord in there. It shortens up as you get older. And there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and a segment is a part of the spinal cord that is supplied by each pair of the spinal nerves. So we have the cervical, the thoracic, the lumbar, and the sacral regions. So the spinal cord has longitudinal grooves on the anterior and the posterior sides, the anterior median fissure and the posterior median sulcus. These are the fissures and the grooves on which your nerves are going to reside. And the spinal cord is divided into an upper cervical region, followed immediately by the thoracic region, then the lumbar region, and then all the way to the bottom is your sacral regions. There are two areas of the spinal cord that are thicker than elsewhere. So there is a cervical bulge. There's a cervical enlargement that gives rise to the nerves of the upper limb. So the brachial plexus and these very important nerves that regulate the axilla and the movement of the upper limbs require that the cervical portion of your spinal cord is more enlarged and has more ganglia and more nerve fibers. And also the lumbosacral region. It is an enlarged region and it gives rise to nerves of the pelvic region. There is no spinal cord in there. This is not the spinal cord. These are the nerves. So the spinal cord is the center, is the computer, the center for the integration. But it doesn't mean it's empty from nerves. So the lumbar and sacral regions are empty from cell bodies, empty from soma, empty from spinal cord computer, but it's not empty from nerves. You have a lot of nerves and you have a lot of ganglia. So these give rise to nerves of the pelvic region and the lower limbs. So it makes a lot of sense that the cervical region, and that is the topmost region of your spinal cord, and in the bottom, your lumbosacral region, these are rich, very thick. They have extensive plexus of nerve fibers and ganglia. Why is that? Because they regulate the topmost part, your cervical region regulates your upper limb, and your lower region, your lumbosacral region, that regulates your lower limbs. There's a medullary cone. They call it the conus medullaris. It is an inferior point of your spinal cord that ends there. And then there is the horse tail, what's known as the coda equina. The coda equina is a bundle of nerve roots that occupy the vertebral canal from the lumbar vertebra 2 to the sacral 5. And these resemble a horse tail. The coda equina is nerves, is not spinal cord. So the spinal cord ends at L1 in terms of soma, in terms of cell bodies, in terms of computers. But the continuation is going to be ganglia and nerve fibers. There we go. So that is the cervical enlargement. And you see that the cervical region is really thick, and the lumbosacral region is also thick because they are important for regulating the upper limbs and the lower limbs, respectively. So that shows you this is the spinal cord, and this is the posterior median sulcus. and these are your bony ribs protecting these are the vertebra that are protecting and shielding and encasing this spinal cord from damage. And these are the spinal nerve rootlets. So you have your spinal cord in the middle, and these nerves, some of them are going out to bring a motor output, and some of them are pointing inward to bring in a sensory input. And all the integration, the computation, the processing happens right in the middle. You have your subarachnoid space, and this is arachnoid matter, and this is the dural sheath. Okay, the meninges are protective layers. These are three fibrous membranes that enclose the brain and the spinal cord. They separate the soft tissue of the central nervous system from the bones of the cranium and the vertebral canal. So from superficial to deep, you have the dura mater, followed by the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. So the dura mater is the most dense and the strongest layer and the outermost layer. It forms loose fitting sleeve known as the dural sheath around the spinal cord. And it is a tough, thick periosteal tissue membrane composed of dense, irregular, and connective tissue. And there is an epidural space. This is a very important space because it is the space between the dura and the vertebral bone. So you have the dura mater, which is the outermost layer in the meninges, followed by your vertebral bones. And the space between that is known as the epidural space. It contains the blood vessels and the fat tissue and the protective loose connective tissue. So the anesthetics can be introduced into the epidural space. That is known as the epidural anesthesia because that's a thick layer that does not give access into the really sensitive spinal cord. Then followed, if we move now medially, we move now more to the inside from the dura mater, the most external layer. We move to the middle layer. We have the arachnoid mater. The arachnoid mater consists of arachnoid membrane adhering to the dura and is separated from the pia mater by fibers spanning the subarachnoid space that is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So this cerebrospinal fluid is very important because it's circulating and holding your brain in a state of buoyancy. So your brain is floating inside your skull. So imagine there was no cerebrospinal fluid. It will fall on your bone tissue. So that's going to cause trauma. That's why this spinal fluid is important to give protection, and it's important to give buoyancy to help your brain float. Who secretes this cerebrospinal fluid? Excellent. These ependymal cells, which are a type of neuroglia. Very good. So the arachnoid mater consists of arachnoid membrane adhering to the dura mater and is separated from the pia mater by fibers spanning the subarachnoid space. So inferior to the medullary cone is the lumbar cister that is located on the spinal tap, known as the lumbar puncture, to sample this cerebrospinal fluid that is highly susceptible to infections that enter through your nasal cavity, microbial infections, bacterial infections, viral infections that enter through your nasal or oral cavity. They can travel through these air-filled sacs and the blood and spinal fluid sacs and enter into your meninges. And lastly, you have the most soft layer, and that is the pia mater. This is a delicate, transparent membrane that follows contours of the spinal cord and continues inferiorly as a form of a fibrous terminal phylum. So the pia mater fuses with the dura to form the coccygeal ligament, and there are ligaments known as the denticulate ligaments, and these are extensions of the pia mater that pass through the arachnoid to the dura mater and the anchoring cord. So this pia mater is the most sensitive layer that protects your spinal cord, and it is intimate with the spinal cord, and that is why it is the most delicate. In the middle, you have your arachnoid matter, and that is your layer that is mostly intimate, not touching the spinal cord, but is touching the cerebrospinal fluid. So that shows us the spinous process of the vertebra, and we see that this is a adipose tissue for energy. And we see that this is the subarachnoid space. This is the layer that is below the arachnoid layer. So you have your dura mater, that's the outermost layer, followed by the arachnoid mater, and between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater is your subarachnoid space. What do we find in this subarachnoid space here between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater? We find the cerebrospinal fluid here. And then lastly, you have your pia mater, and this is your spinal cord. This is your computer. So you see all this big, huge capsule, this bone tissue, and all of these three meninges are protecting this core that's in here. This is your computer. So you see these nerve roots. Some of them are taking out a motor output, and others are bringing in a form of sensory input. So that's a cross section. This is a cross-sectional anatomy of the cervical spinal cord and the central canal and the gray matter. This is the central canal and the gray matter commissure, and these are your meninges. The outer layer is the dura mater, and this is the arachnoid mater, and all the way inside here in pink, that is your pia mater. Okay, the spinal cord has gray matter and white matter, and the white matter is caused by the myelin sheath. And we said that this myelin sheath is like the carpet that is being rolled around the axons, this fibrous tissue. Even though obviously we need nerves in our peripheral nervous system, and we need nerves in our central nervous system. So do we not have nerves in the central nervous system? Are the nerves only scattered in the peripheral nervous system? Obviously, we do need nerve axons in we need nerve axons inside our central nervous system, but they're not nerves. These are just nerve axons. When you have multiple bundles of nerve axons, then you can say you have nerves. Now these nerves have to be they have to have this like saran wrap. They have to have this carpet like fibrous tissue that spins around the axon to protect the axon and increase the speed. What's the name of the cells who do this very important myelination for the nerves in your peripheral nervous system? Schwann cells. What did you say? Stone? Histone. So the histone, they wrap the DNA inside the nucleus. Very good. The histones, they wrap the DNA inside the nucleus. But these guys, they wrap fibrous tissue around the axon in the peripheral nervous system known as the Schwann cells. What's the name of the cells who wrap around fibrous tissue around the central nervous system neuron axon? Oligodendrocytes. Excellent. So white matter, that's pearly. That's bright, pearly white color due to the myelin sheath axon bundles that are coursing up and down the cord. And you have gray matter. Gray matter is dull in color. They have no myelin, and they contain neuronal cell bodies. They have cell bodies, dendrites, and proximal portion of the axon. So that region does not at all. That region does not at all have any form of dendrites. That does not have any form of myelination. That's why it's not white or pearly. That's is gray matter. Do you know Crayola for gray color? They call it gray matter. You guys know that? Do you guys use Crayola? And you know their names? They have so many names. Very funny, interesting names. So one of the, I think it was on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, for like $10 million question. Which of these names is not one of Crayola's names? And gray matter for gray color. And I think it was this was the answer. Okay. So the gray matter is the central core. The central core of the gray matter is shaped like a butterfly. There are two posterior dorsal horns, and they receive sensory nerve fibers that synapse with interneurons. And we said, what are the functions of the interneurons? Yeah, they connect sensory and motor, and they are found in the central nervous system. They do this connection in the central nervous system. You have two posterior horns, and they receive sensory nerve fibers that synapse with interneurons. And you have two anterior, known as ventral horns, and they contain the cell bodies of the motor neurons. So the ventral and anterior horn is for motor neurons, while the posterior horns are for the sensory neurons. There are additional lateral horns that are present in segments thoracic 2 through L1, and they are associated with sympathetic nervous system. So the left and the right sides connected by the gray commissure, and these represent the central canal at the center of the commissure. So the white matter surrounds the gray matter, and there are three large bundles of the axons. There is a posterior, lateral, and anterior funiculus on each side of the cord. So each funiculus is subdivided into fasciculi or tract. So these tracts are bundles of nerves. Yes. Yeah, so the white matter is white because it's pearly due to this white fibrous tissue that is surrounding the axons. But the gray matter does not have this myelination. That's why it's just because it's made up of cell body and the soma and the dendrites and the axon hillock, just the beginning part of the axon. So that does not get myelinated. We myelinate the middle up to the end of the axon to speed up the nerve conduction, because the conduction is just beginning to come out from the cell body and the soma and the axon hillock. Then it begins to be conducted during the middle part of the axon. So that's where we need the myelination. And myelination is white, pearly for white matter. And if the normal color of so if you remove all the myelin, and we have non-myelinated axons. So not every single axon has to be myelinated. Some axons in your brain, you will see they are non-myelinated. So if you look at their color, you will see what color are they. They are gray. So the normal natural color of the neuron is that it's gray, but only this saran wrap, this fibrous capsule with the Schwann cells and the oligodendrocytes, that's what make them white and pearly. So that's the gray matter, and this is the posterior horn So you have to know that the posterior horn is important for motor. So the anterior horn has cell bodies for motor neurons, while the posterior is important for sensory neurons. So this is your posterior horn. This is for the sensory neurons, and this is the anterior horn, and that is for motor. That is for motor neurons. Okay. So the spinal tap, known as the lumbar puncture, is always between L3 and L4. And here you see you just have a lot of nerves. You don't have axons. And it is placed between the arachnoid matter and this is a lumbar cistern, and you put the lumbar puncture needle entering the lumbar cistern. Has somebody underwent that before? Did somebody have that? I think I did. I think I did, yeah. They spray on your back like anesthetic, so I didn't feel it. That's the reason why I agreed anyway to do it. I'm sorry?
No, that's not a spray.
Yeah, they given it was actually very effective. I felt nothing. It was on anesthetic that they put it on your back and then they do the injection. I needed it for like I had what is it called? This called the sciatica pain. And you know they love the insurance card. Say, oh come, let's give you an injection. So I did it and yeah.
But that's not a spinal tap.
It is a spinal tap.
Injection.
That is a spinal tap. What? It wasn't a tor. No, no, no. Toradol. What is? You got it all wrong. Toradol is in your butt. No, that was spinal. Yes, it is. No, it's the same. Did somebody ever have that?
Why would they put a spinal tap because it was sciatica?
Because it's anti-pain medication. Yeah, yeah. It's an injection that is really they put it in your spinal cord, and it actually helped a lot. It helped me a lot, and then it goes away. But it makes your blood sugar go up. When you guys take endocrine system, when you guys do the endocrine system, you guys are gonna learn that. Okay, what's going on? Why are you guys talking? I don't understand. You guys think what I had wasn't a spinal tap?
It's not. Spinal tap is when they draw, they take something out. That's what I thought. So then it's
I think it gets. Oh, so you're talking about it in the sense that they taking a sample for meningitis. It can go the other way too. They can insert some substance that is pain alleviator. Yeah, because it's the same procedure. It's the same procedure. But the interesting thing is you feel nothing. I feel nothing. But I saw a patient where they do the spinal tap and they do not give them that anesthesia. So they were jumping all the time. So I said I don't want it. They said no, we will give you the spray. You will feel anything. Then I agreed. Okay, so I don't know if I should go back again, but okay, that when they make you sign a contract if things go wrong. Like okay, I agreed at the time, but now I don't. Okay, and at the time I was very heavy. Now when you lose weight, the compression is a little better, a lot better on your. Yeah, now my discs are more relaxed. Before it was like so squeezed up. Okay, fibers in a given tract. Those who came late, you saw what happened in the news? The last yesterday, the homeless guy who killed three people in New York here.
The one that's bad.
Actually, you're gonna stay late to be safe. You know, there was one, I was really rooting for that one patient who was in the critical care for 24 hours, but they announced this morning. I came here 7 a.m. You know, I just wanted to prepare. When I saw it on the news, I lost my mind. I couldn't read anything. So she died. She died. This was in Manhattan. That could have been anybody. At the time I was in the subway, he killed a 36-year-old man. That's me. And then he killed another 36-year-old woman. And then he killed, yeah, a seven. I mean, like that could have been me. That could have been me. And then a 76-year-old man fishing. And why would you fish 8 a.m.? I don't know, but that guy, he was fishing 8 a.m. You're supposed to fish early? I'm very disturbed. Yeah, so this one, okay. Okay, guys, can I have your attention, please? In the past, we just been doing lecture study guides. This one is based on your lab because now I'm going to intensify more on the lab. So those photos, focus on them. Obviously, the questions that you do for your homework, focus on those really well. In addition to that, those study guides, please like write what you learned, describe the image, go in depth because these now we're gonna focus more on the labs. So all the questions on your homework, know them really well for your exam. They're gonna be on your exam. Those homework questions, know them really well. What's gonna make a difference is the lab. So that one, those photos, I already gave you the photos. Study these photos deeply. They have the labels, right? They have the A, B, C. Yeah, so to look at these labels, understand them, and now it's up to you to speculate what the question gonna be. Is it gonna be a structure? I already gave you the question. Now you just have to make sense out of it. It's like a puzzle. Is this question gonna be a structure? Is it gonna be function? So know all the homework questions. That's how you're gonna do well. But if you want to do really well, now spend more time on the labs. Okay? Yes. What you saw in there in the study guide, these are all I already made the exam. These are your exam. That is your exam. It's like an open book, but you prepare before you come take the exam. Okay. And the homework, those questions on the homework, you got to know all of them. And then you do the lab. Okay, now the spinal tract, from the name, now this spinal cord has to relay and send out information. Okay, so this spinal cord has to send out information and receive information. Like when you make a phone call to the hospital, you need the ambulance, or you make a phone call to the police, you need the fire department, or you need the police department. Who's gonna make that integration to send the proper output? If you need an ambulance, they send the fire department. That's not gonna help you. You need the police, they send the ambulance. That's not gonna help you. So you need these tracks. So from the name is very interesting. You have ascending track. Good morning. You have ascending tracks and descending tracks. So fibers in a given track have similar origin, destination, and function. There are ascending tracks. These ascending tracks carry sensory information up. That's really important to know that the ascending tracks, they carry sensory, not motor, sensory information up to the brain. While the descending tracks, they bring down information from the spinal cord. So the ascending tracks bring up information to the spinal cord. Up sensory, up information to the spinal cord, ascending. While descending tracks, they bring down descending motor, efferent output from your descending tracks. Then what is the property of decussation? This name is very important for neurology. Decussation. Decussation is when you cross, when you reach a point and you go from the right side into the left side. So it's the crossing of the midline that occurs in many tracks so that the brain senses and controls contralateral side of the body. So what does that mean? That means a patient who has, God forbid, a stroke on the right side of the brain, they cannot move some part of the left part of their body. So that signifies decussation. So that means the tract goes up to a particular nucleus in your spinal cord, and then it decussates to the other side. So a lesion there is going to prevent the passage to the contralateral side. So your brain cannot, and your spinal cord cannot regulate only one side. It has to be able to regulate ipsilaterally on one side and contralaterally. And we will see more about that. Contralateral means when the origin and destination of a tract are on opposite sides of the body, while ipsilateral is when the origin and destination of tract are on the same side of the body. So you have a subway line that goes from Brooklyn, ends in Brooklyn. So that's an example of ipsilateral. But if you cross the bridge and you go to another borough that's on the opposite side, then that is known as contralateral. If you stay on the same side, that is ipsilateral. So when the origin, so if you have a stroke on the left side, you cannot move the left side, then you know the damage happened to the nerve that is ipsilateral. But if the damage happened to the left side, but you cannot move the right side, then you know that is a stroke that affected a contralateral nerve tract. So all the ascending tracts, some of them are ipsilateral, others are contralateral. And descending tracts, some of them are ipsilateral and others are contralateral. So these are the, but remember, ascending tracts always carry what kind of input? Sensory. Because you can never have a motor input. You can never have a motor input. So input is always sensory. And descending tracts always sense what kind of motor output. Because you can never have an output that is sensory. The output is always motor. So the ascending tracts, these are sensory signals that travel across three neurons from the origin, the receptors, to destinations in the sensory areas of the brain. So these are very important concepts. So now we've learned that the ascending tracts carry sensory information up to the spinal cord, not up to the brain. These are ascending tracts of the spinal cord. The spinal cord is a brain. The spinal cord is a brain. It is a computer. It just does not look like the brain. So the the sensory signals travel across three neurons from the origin, the receptors, to the destinations in the sensory areas of the brain. There are first order neurons, second order neurons, and third order neurons. The first order neurons detect the stimulus and transmit the signal to the spinal cord or the brainstem. So that's their maximal destination. They carry the input from your finger, they carry a heat stimuli, they carry a mechano pressure sense, tactile stimulation, they carry some chemical signal, but the maximum they can get to is the spinal cord or your brain. Then they stop there. Then they synapse. They synapse with an interneuron who's your second order neuron. This second order neuron pick up from the first order neuron and continues to the thalamus at the upper end of the brainstem. We said that this brainstem is ambiguous because it is not just one organ. What is the brainstem? A collection of organs who are your medulla, the pons, and the diencephalon. Cerebrum is too big, the diencephalon. Okay, we will get to that. And then it continues to the thalamus at the upper end of the brainstem. And then the third neuron would pick up, third order neuron would pick up the signal would carry the signal the rest of the way to the sensory region of the cerebral cortex. Now that third neuron is going to take you to the computer center. So the first order neuron is dealing with the receptor to the thalamus, to the spinal cord. I'm sorry, from the receptor to the spinal cord or the brain stem if you go into the brain. Then from the spinal cord to the thalamus, or from the spinal cord or from the receptor to the brain, or from the brain to the thalamus, you have second order neurons. And then from the thalamus to your sensory region of the spinal cord, that is third order neuron. This is so important. So first of all, you have your receptor, and we have different kinds. There is chemoreceptor, there is thermoreceptor, there is mechanoreceptor, there is nociceptor, there is a osmoreceptor. All of these guys are gonna send their information through a primary first order neuron. Then you would have, they would begin from the receptor and they would end at the brain stem, or they would end at the spinal cord. Then from the spinal cord, all the way from the spinal cord, all the way to the thalamus, so from the spinal cord to the thalamus, or from the brain stem to the thalamus, that's a second order neuron. And then from the thalamus to your sensory region, if you're dealing with a visual stimuli, or if you're dealing with a mechanostimuli, when you go to the sensory region in your cortex, that is a third order neuron. But what is in common between all of them? They're all, I'm sorry? I cannot hear that. They're all neurons, obviously, but what are they carrying? They're all carrying sensors. Yeah. We're not carrying no motor. Okay. From the thalamus to the brain, where the computer to compute the computation and the integration and the processing would happen. So that one will take you to the headquarters, but you don't go in one trip. You have to do transit. You fly from here to this airport, from here to that one, and that one takes you there. The posterior funniculus. The posterior funniculus consists of a cuneate fasciculus and gracile fasciculus. What are those? The gracile fasciculus carry signals from the mid-thoracic and lower parts of the body. So that just show you the type of tracts, like the gracile fasciculus and the cuneate fasciculus. They carry signals from the chest and the upper limbs. The first order nerve fibers travel up the ipsilateral side of the spinal cord, terminating at the medulla. They are terminating at the medulla. The second order neurons cross to the other side of the brain, and they carry the signals for vibration, visceral pain, deep and discriminative touch, and proprioception from the lower limbs and the trunk. Proprioception is a non-visual sense of the position and movement of the body. So we have the spinothalamic tract. The spinothalamic tract is a part of the anterolateral system that passes up the anterior and lateral funiculi of the spinal cord. So the spinothalamic tract, what does it carry? It carries signals for pain, pressure, temperature, light touch, tickle, and itch. So this spinothalamic tract is composed of axons of second order neurons. So this is a tract that is specialized tract that is all the tract is bundle of nerves, and all of these nerves, they are not primary, they are not tertiary, they are secondary order neurons, meaning they receive input from the spinal cord and they are headed to the thalamus. They are headed to the thalamus. The first order neurons end in the posterior horn of the spinal cord. We said that. We said that which horns of the spinal cord deal with sensory stimuli, posterior or anterior? Posterior. So that is your dorsal posterior horn dealing with sensory stimuli. The anterior horn or the ventral horn is dealing with motor neurons. So the second order neurons start in a posterior horn and then they decussate and form the spinal thalamic. So they start in the posterior horn, bring in sensory information dorsally. And when they get to they get when the second order neurons, they start in the posterior horn and then they decussate. After they decussate, that is how they are rounded up and they make this bundle known as the spinal thalamic tract. But what sensation are they carrying? They're only carrying pain, pressure, temperature, light touch, tickle, and itch. The third order neurons continue to the cerebral cortex. Obviously, after we reach the thalamus, we take the third order neurons and we continue to the cerebral cortex. So due to the cross of second order neurons, signals are sent to the cerebral hemisphere that is contralateral to the site of the stimulus. So that is very interesting. So because we decussate, because we perform this decussation and form the spinothalamic tract, we end up at the opposite side in our cerebral cortex. So signals are sent to a region in a cerebral hemisphere that is opposite or contralateral from where the signal originated. So here is the decussation. So these are some ascending pathways. So the information obviously doesn't come from the brain. It's trying to get to the brain through a third order neuron. You see your third order neuron? Your third order neuron begins from the thalamus and goes up to the center. So you have receptors for body movement, limb positions, and they have fine touch discrimination and pressure. It goes into your spinal cord, and if you compare here, you will see that this is this an ipsilateral or contralateral transmission? This is ipsilateral. Look at the first order neuron is going to get, there's no decussation. So you see that this is the spinothalamic tract. So both of those actually decussate. You see, here there is a decussation that happened from this side, from this lateral side. They decussated into here. That's what formed the spinothalamic tract. So the sensation happened on this side, and decussation happened, information was transferred to this side. Here also, another form of decussation happened. So we did not go up. The information was received here. Had we traveled up all the way, that would have been here, ipsilateral. But because we crossed, that makes it contralateral. Yes. Okay. Can you guys please listen to what Miriam is asking? Yes.
But always like that, the stroke, if you're seeing the disability of the left side, it's right-sided. But then now I'm learning that it can be.
Yeah. It depends on the track. It depends on the track who's carrying. Like I said, the subway. Some subways, they do not cross. You know, some subways go from, supposedly, from Brooklyn to Queens directly. Others, they go through Manhattan and then to Queens. So if you stop the track there, you'll end up in Manhattan. And they expect you to either be in Brooklyn or Queens. But because the subway line you took goes to Queens through Manhattan, but if you took a more direct route, you would go directly Brooklyn, Queens. They don't have that line. They do not have that subway line. They don't have a subway line between Brooklyn and Queens. You have to go through Manhattan. But if that was the case, that would be perfectly ipsilateral. So if that train stops somewhere, you're gonna be somewhere in between Brooklyn and Manhattan. But because you using a third borough, you're going between Brooklyn, Manhattan, then Queens, then you have that is contralateral. So in the case with a patient who has a stroke, your brain is a wide region. So the stroke could be at a site where the third neuron is bringing information that has decussated at the second order. Some other centers, they receive information that is ipsilateral. So it depends. It depends. It's not always contralateral. It depends on the actual, region that you're dealing with, where the stroke had happened. Okay? Okay? Make sense? Okay, you gotta go read that then. You gotta go read that. Okay. So there are some ascending pathways. So ascending pathways always concerned with carrying an input, carrying sensory information from the carrying sensory information that could have decussated at your second order level here. So where does the decussation usually happen? It happens at the order of the second order, receiving the information from the spinal cord going up to the thalamus. So from the thalamus to the brain, no decussation. From the receptor to the spinal cord, no decussation. It's always the second order neuron that's either going to decussate to the opposite side or it's going to move up ipsilaterally. So that shows us here this second order neuron. These are some ascending pathways, and here we also see another form of decussation. So these are some ascending pathways. So receptors for the body movement, the limb position, and these are fine touch carrying, fine touch discrimination. So each track is not only classified based on whether or not it decussates, it also classified based on the sensation that it's carrying. So all these tracks are carrying sensory input, but what kind of sensory input? Some are carrying pain, heat, and cold, while others are carrying balance, sensation, body movement, limb position, fine touch discrimination. Now we move from this spinothalamic tract into the spinal reticular tract. That's another example. It travels up the anterolateral system. It carries pain signals. So this is a specialized tract for pain signal resulting from tissue injury. So it is composed of axons of second order neurons. So that's the same thing as the spinothalamic. Spinothalamic, spine, thalamus. Okay? It's what they call spinothalamic. So nobody needed to tell us that is made up of second order neurons because we already know in order to be a second order neuron, you have to be carrying the stimulus from your spinal cord up to the thalamus or up to the brain. So that's enough to say spinothalamic, spine, thalamus, that's got to be second order neuron. And so is the spinal reticular, because where is the reticular formation? That's in your brain. So the spinothalamic is dealing, because remember we had two lines here. Remember we had two lines. One line is from the spine to the thalamus, right? That's the spinothalamic. That's the spinothalamic. And another one is from the spine to the brain, the brain stem, especially a region known as the reticular formation. Not everybody's going to the thalamus. You can have a second order neuron that is going to the brainstem, and that is the spinal reticular. So from the name, spinothalamic, from the spine and thalamus, spinal reticular, spine and the reticular formation. It carries pain signals resulting from tissue injury, so that region is only activated when there's nerve injury. It is composed of axons of second order neurons. The first order neurons enter the posterior horn and they immediately synapse with second order neurons. We're always entering the posterior horn here. First order neurons always enter posterior horn. Are we ever going to have a first order neuron that's going to enter the anterior horn? Why not? Because it's only sensory. Excellent. So it's going to, then when we synapse, we're going to go up. Now we have two possibilities. You see, everybody got to take one route. You're going to come in the spinal cord. The first order neuron is only one kind. It is the second order neuron that is different kind. Why? Because you can go from the spine to the thalamus or from the spine to the brain. This is the ones that are going to be different. Now, the spinal reticular carries pain, and the first order neurons enter the posterior horn and immediately synapse with the second order neurons. And then you have second order neurons that decussate to the opposite anterolateral system, and they ascend the cord and end in the reticular formation, which is loosely organized core of the gray matter in the medulla and the pons. The spinal tracts. The spinal tracts. You have the posterior and anterior spinocerebellar tracts. Interesting. Now, spinocerebellar. Spinocerebellar. Now, we're no longer dealing with spinothalamic. We're not dealing with spinal reticular. Now, spinocerebellar. So that means we're going from the spine to the cerebellum. Excellent. So they carry proprioceptive signals from the limbs and the trunk up to the cerebellum. They are composed of axons of second order neurons. They are composed of axons of second order neurons. The first order neurons originate in the muscle and the tendons, and they end in posterior horn of the spinal cord. So they originate in the muscles and the tendons and end in the posterior horn of the spinal cord. That's the first order neuron. Then the second order neuron ascend the spinocerebellar tract and end in the cerebellum, providing it with feedback needed to coordinate movement. So that tells you the cerebellum is specialized for movement. Then now we're talking about descending tracts. So we have finished with our, how many ascending tracts we have? 3. Thank you very much. Who said that? Miriam. Very good. What's the first one? Sinothalamic is important for what? Pain, temperature, light touch, tickle. You see, it's right here. Pain, pressure, you see, temperature, light touch, tickle, and itch. Then after spinothalamic, what else do we have? Somebody other than Miriam. Spinal reticular. Why is that important? Because it carries what? It carries sensory, yes, but what kind of sensation? There's difference in pain of damaged tissue. You see, that's the spinal reticular, carries pain from tissue injury. And lastly, you have posterior and anterior spinocerebellar tracts. These are posterior and anterior spinocerebellar tracts. They travel through the lateral funiculus, and we talked about that. And then lastly, you had your spinocerebellar, and that's to coordinate movement. Now, descending tracts, they don't have three neurons. They don't have three neurons. They have an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. It's interesting. How do you tell if a patient had damage in the upper motor neuron versus a patient who has damage in the lower motor neuron? Or upper motor, not upper limbs. No. Upper motor means you're gonna have excessive agitation, stiffness, everything plus plus, spasticity. They will everything rigid, everything exacerbated. Lower motor neuron is gonna be the opposite, the brain. It's gonna be so flaccid. So upper motor neuron damage, you will see the patient stiff, while lower is gonna be so flaccid. So the upper motor neurons originate, so they are descending. So they don't come from the horn. They don't come from the horn. They target the anterior, the ventral horn. You have upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. They involve two motor neurons. So you have upper motor neurons that originate in the cerebral cortex or the brainstem, and they terminate on a lower motor neuron. They originate in the cerebral cortex or the brainstem, and they terminate on a lower motor neuron. Then the lower motor neuron is a cell body in the brainstem or the spinal cord, and the axon leads to a muscle or other target organ. The upper motor neuron comes down and it targets the lower motor neuron because it's bringing in an output. So it originates from the center because we just received sensory input, we integrated, we want to generate an output. So it's coming out of the cerebral cortex or the brainstem, and they terminate on the lower motor neuron. The lower motor neuron is a cell body. The lower motor neuron is a cell body in the brain stem or spinal cord, and the axon lead to target other organs. So the upper motor neuron is going to target the lower motor neuron, who's going to be in my spinal cord, and then the cell body is going to be in the spinal cord that's going to carry out this output. So there are lateral or anterior corticospinal. So from the name you can tell, corticospinal. Cortical meaning the brain. So is that ascending? This is not spinothalamic. If you begin with the spine, you know you're ascending. Spinothalamic, spinal reticular, spinocerebellar, you're going up. But here, corticospinal. So now spinal is not in the beginning, spinal in the end. So that means you're going down. You're doing corticospinal. So that's down. So there's two of them. There's lateral and anterior corticospinal tracts. They carry signals from the cerebral cortex for precise, finely coordinated movements. So the pyramids are ridges on the anterior surface of the medulla oblongata. They are formed from fibers of this system. So the pyramids are ridges on the anterior surface of the medulla oblongata, They are formed from fibers of this system. Most fibers decussate in the lower medulla, forming the lateral corticospinal tract on the contralateral side of the spinal cord. Some fibers form the anterior or ventral corticospinal tract that descends in the ipsilateral side of the spinal cord and decussates inferiorly. Like the lateral tract, they ultimately control the contralateral muscles. So you see, these are the two descending pathways. So you have the primary motor cortex, that is the center. And this is bringing down to me, so that all of that is my upper motor neuron. And from here and outward, that is my lower motor neurons. So one of them is going to be ipsilateral, and one is going to decussate here at the medulla. So you have the cerebrum, and this is the midbrain, and that's the medulla, and this is the lateral corticospinal tract is going to decussate in the medulla. While this, I am very bothered with how you're laughing while I'm teaching. Like, this is what is happening. What's going on? You've been doing this since the beginning of class day. What's happening? Yes, you and the friend behind you. So this figure is showing us how we have these two different tracks. One of them decussate. One of them decussate. You see, and they label for you. Where is the decussation happening? One side is the medullary pyramid. So that side is the side, the pyramid is where the decussation happened. That's the site where you expect the decussation to happen. So if you want to track if this track is going to decussate or not, look in the pyramid. Does it decussate there or not? If it doesn't, then it is not going to be contralateral.
How do you know if it's going to deficit?
So you examine the medullary pyramid. Does it cross it? If it crosses it, you see the decussation, it crossed. This one here, the anterior corticospinal tract, you see this light lime color, it did not go through the medullary pyramid. Yeah. So, but this one, it did. So that shows the lateral corticospinal tract decussated into this region, while the anterior corticospinal tract continues and it does not decussate. It terminally decussates in the spinal cord, but it does not decussate in the medulla. So the special thing here is to realize that the lateral corticospinal descending tract decussate in the medulla, while the anterior corticospinal tract does not decussate in the medulla, it decussate in the spinal cord. Good. Today you guys are neurologists.
Yes.
Okay. So so you have other descending tracts. So besides this, so from the name, you can tell from the name, spinal. This is corticospinal tract. So the first one was the corticospinal tract. Now you're not having a corticospinal, you have a tectospinal tract. It begins in the roof of the midbrain. So that's the region, not a cortical region. That is a tectal region in your midbrain. It descends contralateral. Uh, it descends contralaterally through the spinal cord as far as the neck, and it functions in the reflex turning of the head in response to sights and sounds. So a nice question on the exam would be, which tract is responsible for flexing or extending or the reflexive movement of the head That's the tectospinal. That's the tectospinal. And then you have two more tracts. You see, they all end with spinal. All with spinal. You have the lateral and medial reticulospinal spinal tract. The reticulospinal tract. They originate in the, from the name, reticulo, the reticular formation of the brainstem, and they control the muscles of the upper and lower limbs, especially those for posture, and balance. They contain descending analgesic pathways that regulate transmission of the pain signals to the brain. Lateral and medial vestibulospinal tract. It begins in the brainstem, the vestibular nuclei. They receive impulses for balance from the inner ear. They control extensor muscles of the limbs for balance control. Now, diseases such as poliomyelitis and itis, that means inflammation, caused by the poliovirus. So it enters the dorsal root ganglia and, are you okay? Yeah. You said you're okay.
Oh, I got an 80 on the first one and a 90 on the first. Can you look at it? Yeah. I didn't want to like, that's why I went to look. Yeah, me too. She's acting crazy. Then she might decide to not like you and not give you what you got. I'm like, no, that's not my side. That part. No, exactly. But every other thing side, but I don't hurt. She'll tell you she put it in, she ain't gonna put it in. So we I got an email about putting it in, and I think that's what she was like, sure of the grade. Right. Like, I don't want to find out. I'm not doing good. Right. See it, I'm not gonna put it in. I don't think so. She's looking good, yeah, but don't want to go just stand on the line. She was that. I do it. Like, oh, maybe you want to go? Yeah, I want to go first. When I got there, she's like, oh, you're doing so good in the class. I'm like, oh, really? Well, that took me by surprise. Yeah, I think for that. So I don't think we're not we're going to DJ thing, just that I end up with the that's why I got one. It's only, oh yeah, me too. And even some of the homework she did. Yeah, I know a lot of people. Yeah. She still didn't give me a break for the oh my God. That we ate homework. Yeah, she didn't give me anything. And then I redid it. Yeah, and I didn't put it into the, I didn't put it into the care plan. I just did it. The same way that I had it and just added and I did like, yeah. Because with the, putting it into that care plan, I would have to make math stuff up and I didn't.
Okay, guys. Thank God he's okay. Thank God no seizure or anything. He's just gotta go home and relax, and he's gonna listen to the video at home. Okay. I said poliomyelitis. I'm, I'm sorry.
Bring him stuff.
No, he's gonna come back. He's fine. He didn't just leave. No, he's gonna leave. Like they are nursing him. Yeah. He's receiving nurse care from multiple. He's sick at the right place. Okay. So we said that itis is always the inflammation. Polio, that's the virus who caused the inflammation in the nerve root ganglia in your ventral horn. Then ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. That's also known as there's a player. They named this Lou Gehrig. Very good, very good. Lou Gehrig disease. It causes destruction of the motor neurons, leading to skeletal muscle atrophy. There was also this, Stephen Hawking. You guys know Stephen Hawking? There's a very big mathematician. He was a math professor in England, and he got this infection, and it just destroys the anterior horn neurons that lead to just the skeletal muscles. Not every single output motor neuron is going to target the somatic muscle. There's visceral motor neurons, there is sympathetic visceral, there is parasympathetic visceral, there is anterior visceral. So all that is working. It is just that one division, the somatic motor division of his peripheral nervous system that is going to be damaged. Poliomyelitis caused by the polio virus It destroys motor neurons in the brainstem and the anterior horn of the spinal cord. Signs of polio include muscle pain, weakness, and the loss of some reflexes. It is followed by paralysis, muscular atrophy, and respiratory arrest. The virus spreads by fecal contamination of water. Yeah, that's not good. So that's why food hygiene is important. You don't want to lose your anterior horn motor neurons because the deli guy didn't wash his hand. You know, it happens. Yeah, the deli guy. I said, can I have maybe, yeah, all of them. You know, I said to the deli guy, can I get pickled jalapenos? He put pickles and jalapenos.
Oh, but then you don't go back there, right?
So I believe that it wasn't him, it was another one. I believe that English test should be part of the license for deli.
One time my brother went to McDonald's, he said he wanted a, what did he say, a hamburger plain? They literally gave him just the bun. Me too, don't worry. Me too, my daughter like. And he was eating it, he was so pissed off, he was like, oh,
Yeah.
God.
I said I want pickled, ED, pickled, not and, ED. Pickled jalapenos. And he puts pickles and jalapenos. Alrighty. Okay, so polio and amyotrophic or Lou Gehrig's disease. That's destruction of the motor neurons and muscular atrophy. Also, the sclerosis or the scarring of the lateral regions of the spinal cord. There are astrocytes. The astrocytes fail to reabsorb the neurotransmitter glutamate from the tissue fluid, which accumulates to toxic levels. So that's caused by defect of the astrocytes. Early signs are muscular weakness, difficulty speaking and swallowing and using hands. There are sensory and intellectual functions remain unaffected. So the problem here is that because the person is suffering from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis and they have an inability to relay motor output, they cannot speak properly, they cannot relay and communicate their emotion. People think they have no emotion and they have no ideas. And that's actually more troubling and more painful to the patient than the actual disease itself. For the people to assume that these people have no emotion and they don't think, like, people with disabilities, they don't respect the people with disabilities, thinking that they don't have emotions or they're like animals. No, they actually have more sensitivity. Due to the disability, they are more sensitive, they have more emotion, they have more ideas, they just cannot get them. But people don't treat them well. Okay, now when we look at the nerve and the ganglia, so the spinal cord communicates with the rest of the body through the spinal nerves. So a nerve is a cord-like organ that is composed of numerous nerve fibers, axons that are bound together by connective tissue. And they may contain anywhere from a few nerve fibers to a million. There are smaller branches called peripheral nerves. So we know that the nerves are a collection of the axons, collection of nerve axons. A cord-like organ composed of numerous nerve fibers, axons, bound together by connective tissue. They may contain anywhere from a few nerve fibers to a million. So there are smaller branches called peripheral nerves. Disorders of these nerves are the peripheral neuropathy. There are wrappings and associated structures of a nerve. So the nerve fibers of the peripheral nervous system are surrounded by Schwann cells, forming neurolemma and myelin sheath around the axon. So you have the endoneurium, so just please remember that the nerve is a cord-like organ composed of so it's a bundle of nerve fibers, axons, bound together by connective tissue. So they can have few fibers up to a million fibers. And smaller branches are called peripheral nerves, and you could have diseases like peripheral neuropathy. Wrappings and associated structures of a nerve. You have nerve fibers of the peripheral nervous system. These are surrounded by Schwann cells, forming a neural lemma and myelin sheath around the axon. The endoneurium is a loose connective tissue external to the neural lemma. And you have the perineurium. The perineurium is layers of overlapping squamous cells that wrap fascicles. These are bundles of nerve fibers. The epineurium is a dense, irregular connective tissue that wraps the entire nerve. So the blood vessels penetrate connective tissue coverings, and they provide plentiful blood supply. The general anatomy of the nerves and the ganglia. So nerves are classified as sensory, motor, and you can have some mixed. So sensory nerves are composed only of afferent fibers. They carry signals from the sensory receptors to the central nervous system. They are rare. They include nerves for smell and vision. So the motor nerves are composed only of efferent fibers that carry the signals from the central nervous system to the muscles and the glands. There are mixed nerves that consist of both afferent and efferent fibers. They are based on the organs they innervate. Sensory and motor fibers can also be described as somatic or visceral. These are general or special. So the ganglion is a cluster of nerve cell bodies outside the central nervous system. They are enveloped in an epineurium continuous with that of the nerve. These are clusters of nerve cell bodies. So when you have clusters of nerve axons, these are known as nerves. But when you have clusters of cell bodies outside the central nervous system, these are no longer known as horns. These are called ganglion. So among the cell bodies are bundles of nerve fibers leading into and out of the ganglion. So there's a posterior root ganglion associated with spinal nerves. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. There are 8 cervical nerves. Would have the first cervical nerve exits between the skull and the atlas, and the others exit at the intervertebral foramina. So the first cervical nerve exits between the skull and the atlas, while the others would exit at the intervertebral foramina. There are 12 thoracic, T1 to T12, and there are 5 lumbar, L1 to L5. There are 5 sacral, S1 to S5, and there is 1 coccygeal. Proximal branches. So each spinal nerve is formed from 2 roots. These are proximal branches, formed from 2 roots known as proximal branches. So there's a posterior dorsal root that is it has sensory input to the spinal cord. So the dorsal root is made up of We said that the posterior dorsal root is important for reception of sensory input. It contains neurosomes of sensory neurons carrying signals to the spinal cord. There are 6 to 8 rootlets that enter the posterior horn of the cord, and there's an anterior ventral root, is a motor output out of the spinal cord. There are 6 to 8 rootlets. These 6 to 8 rootlets leave the spinal cord and converge to form anterior root. They converge to form the anterior root. The coda equina is formed from the roots arising from L2 to coda equina 1. The distal branches. These branches extend beyond the vertebra. So the nerve divides into distal branches. You have the anterior ramus and the posterior ramus. So in the thoracic region, each gives rise to an intercostal nerve. So in other regions, the anterior rami form the nerve plexuses. So the posterior ramus innervates the muscles and joins in that region of the spine and the skin of the back. Meningeal branches. They re-enter the vertebral canal and innervate the meninges, the vertebra, and the spinal ligaments. Chickenpox. Chickenpox or varicella is a common disease of early childhood caused by varicella zoster virus. It produces itchy rash that clears up without complications. So the virus remains for life in the posterior root ganglia, and it is kept in check by the immune system. Now, shingles or herpes zoster is different from the chickenpox. It is not caused by the varicella zoster virus. This is herpes zoster. It is localized. It is a localized disease caused by the virus traveling down the sensory nerves by fast axonal transport when the immune system is compromised. So there's painful trail of skin discoloration and fluid-filled vesicles along the path of the nerve, usually on the chest and the waist on one side of the body. It is common after the age 50. Childhood chickenpox vaccinations reduce the risk of shingles later in life. See, this is a shingle lesion tracking the dermatome of a sensory nerve. Anterior rami. The anterior rami branch and anastomose. So the anterior rami branch and the anastomose repeatedly to form 5 nerve plexus. You have the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, the lumbar plexus, the sacral plexus, and the coccygeal plexus. The cervical plexus in the back, C1 to C5, supplies the neck and the phrenic nerves to the diaphragm. The brachial plexus near the shoulder, C5 to T1, they supply the upper limb and some of the shoulder and the neck. They are divided into roots, trunks, divisions, and cords. It's very interesting. The brachial plexus is near the shoulder. It supplies the upper limb, and you have the cervical plexus extending from C1 to C5. They supply the neck and the phrenic nerves to the diaphragm. And then there's the lumbar plexus. The lumbar plexus in the lower back, L1 to L4, they supply the abdominal wall, anterior thigh, and the genitalia from L1 to L4. They supply the abdominal wall, the anterior thigh, and the genitalia. Then there's the sacral plexus in the pelvis. They supply the remainder of the lower trunk and lower limb, including the sciatic nerve. And lastly, you have the coccygeal. These nerve plexes have both somatosensory and motor function. The somatosensory function carries sensory signals from the bones, the joints, the muscles, and the skin. And they carry touch, heat, cold, stretch, pressure, and pain sensation. They provide proprioception. So the brain receives the information about the body position and the movement from nerve endings in the muscles, the tendons, and the joints. So motor functions are primarily to stimulate the muscle contraction. That's your cervical plexus extending from C1 to C5. Then there's the brachial plexus extending from C5 to T1. So that is your brachial plexus. So this shows the cutaneous innervation of the hand by nerves from the brachial plexus. That's your median nerve, that's your radial nerve, that's the ulnar, and that's the musculocutaneous nerve. And that is your lumbar plexus. That shows you the lumbar plexus extends from L1 to L5. Sacral and coccygeal plexus. They extend from L4 up to coccygeal 1. So we have very dangerous injuries about our nerves, and you have your radial nerve injury. So radial nerve injury is when you have the radial nerve, the nerve that passes through the axilla may be compromised by crutches. So when the people put the crutches, one of the questions on the exam would be a patient is suffering from crutch paralysis. So the pressure, the trauma of leaning with their axilla on the crutch, that causes damage to which nerve? That is the radial nerve. Also, there is wrist drop. This wrist drop is when fingers, hand, and the wrist chronically flexed because the extensor muscles are paralyzed and they cannot oppose the flexors. The sciatic nerve injury known as sciatica is sharp pain that travels from the gluteal region along the posterior side of the thigh and the leg to the ankle. This is a very painful injury. You know, this pain will make you forget any other pain that it coexists with it. And 90%, you gotta go, you have that one? Yeah, me too. 90%, that's what I got the spinal tap for. Yeah, that one hurts a lot. I think most of the people have it. 90% of cases result from herniated intervertebral disc or osteoarthritis of the lower spine. You know, these people wrestling, the youth, you know, your old age, you pay the bills for the foolishness you do in the youth. You know, and these, I've seen these people playing the basketball and the football, getting hit in their hips, and you know, they think it's, you're gonna pay the bill 15 years. You're not gonna feel it now, but in 15 years you're gonna feel it. Yes.
So what's the difference between like sciatica pain and like neuropathy?
So neuropathy is a general, sciatica is a form of neuropathy. Pathy is disease. Neuro is nerve. Usually neuropathy refers to nerves or damage to nerve collections of axons. So there's deterioration, peripheral neuropathy. But neuropathy is a pain of pathy is disease, disease of the nerve. So that's a generalized term, yeah. But a sciatic nerve is you have inflammation, irritation of the nerve endings of this sciatic nerve. So that causes the inflammation, redness, heat, pain, swelling, loss of function. You can't even move your leg. So that is caused by the sciatic nerve. But it's interesting. You can be friend with it. And I actually there is you can be friend with your disease if you know how to adapt to it. So you lose weight and you avoid compression. And I heard that if you drink, there is a special type of fat that if you dissolve it and you drink it, it's gonna make the herniated disc restore. Yeah, yeah. But it has to be no, 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 not when you're drunk. You have to get, the fat, the white tissue. So you get the fat and you dissolve the fat and you drink it when you wake up in the morning, before you get any meal, you dissolve the fat into liquid and you drink it, something like that. Hmm?
Okay.
Guys, it's very simple. You know, the white tissue. Everybody knows what Rene. You know what fat is. Yeah. Okay, so you get the fat, you dissolve the fat in the fire until it becomes from fat, solid to liquid, and you drink that. No, I want to know where it is. I know what you're saying. I just want omega-3. No. And it's not the fat from the cow. You have to listen to me. You have to listen to me. It's not the fat of the cow. It's not the fat of the pig. It's not the fat of the goat. It's the fat of the sheep, of the desert, of the Arabia.
Yeah.
Oh, I gotta go all the way to Arabia. If you wanna cure your sciatica, I'm gonna go do that. Would you buy my ticket? Are you a ticket? Or maybe I can bring you some with me. That's a better solution. Okay. Okay. So, a specific area of skin. So, not even any sheep. It has to be the sheep of the desert, of the Arabia. Okay. Anyways.
You gotta be dry.
So maybe it has to do with the food that it eats. But anyways, so the dermatomes. These are specific areas of the skin that convey sensory input to spinal nerve. The dermatome map is a diagram of cutaneous regions innervated by each spinal nerve. So each spinal nerve is shown the overall jurisdiction of each nerve. How much of the tissue does it cover? And it's very interesting that nerves, they can share. They can share the same region. That's why when you get injury to one nerve, the other nerve can help you move the muscle. So that's very interesting. So the dermatome is a specific area of the skin that conveys sensory input. These are not for motor, these are for sensation. And dermatomes overlap. That's a very interesting thing. There's a gray area. They overlap their edges as much as 50%. So if you lose one nerve, 50% of the other nerve can help you move that muscle. Can help you not move the muscle, can help you sense from that area. Is necessary to anesthetize 3 successive spinal nerves to produce a total loss of sensation in one dermatome. Wow. So we have to anesthetize 3 successive spinal nerves to produce a total loss of sensation in one dermatome. You see, this is a dermatome map. So the spinal nerves, you see they're all overlapping. Thoracic nerves all overlapping. This is the sacral nerves, and these are the lumbar nerves. Now, we look at somatic reflexes. So reflexes are obviously involuntary, and these are quick stereotype reactions of muscles. These are quick stereotype reactions. Um, These are involuntary stereotype reactions of glands or muscles to stimulation. So reflexes require stimulation, initial stimulation. These are not spontaneous actions, but these are responses to sensory input. The reflexes are quick, so they involve few, if any, interneurons and minimum synaptic delay. So they do not involve interneurons because they have to be very rapid. Reflexes are involuntary, meaning that they occur without intent and they are difficult to suppress. They occur without intent and they're difficult to suppress, and they're stereotyped, meaning they occur essentially the same way every time. So reflexes include glandular secretion and contraction of all three types of the muscle. There are somatic and visceral reflexes. Reflexes involve the somatic nervous system innervating skeletal muscle, like the tendon reflex. When you hit with the hammer, you have the knee jerk reflex because you hit the patellar tendon with the hammer, and that's going to cause the involuntary stereotype um, um, quick reflex. Visceral reflexes. These are reflexes involving organs such as soft tissue, your heart and your intestine. Your heart and your intestine. A somatic reflex involves a reflex arc with the following pathway. So somatic reflex involved a reflex arc with the following pathway. Get a chair, I'm tired. Okay, excuse me. So a somatic reflex involves a reflex arc. So it's like a bow, like an arc. You know the arc, you pull the arc and then the arrow is gonna involuntarily go. So that's why they call it a reflex arc, because it involves multiple components that is like a cycle. So somatic receptors in the skin, muscles, or tendons. It involves somatic obviously there has to be receptors. When you hit that knee-jerk reflex, you have to strike somatic receptors in the skin, the muscle, or the tendon. The next step afferent nerve fibers are going to carry the information from the receptors to the posterior horn of the spinal cord or the brainstem. Okay, the afferent nerve fibers, they carry information from receptors to the posterior horn of the spinal cord or the brainstem. There's an integrating center. The integrating center is a point of synaptic contact between the neurons in the gray matter of the cord or the brainstem. The integrating center is a point of synaptic contact between the neurons in the gray matter of the cord or the brainstem. They determine whether efferent neurons issue signal to the muscles. The efferent nerve fibers carry motor impulses to muscles, and the effectors, these are the muscles that carry out the effect. They carry out the response. So now let's look at the reflexive arc of the patellar knee-jerk reflex. Number one, the receptor in the muscle near the tendon is stimulated by this hit. Number two, an afferent sensory fiber is going to carry this sensation to my anterior or posterior horn. Posterior horn. So you'd have a cell body of a sensory neuron is going to integrate and send to the cell body of, this is the motor neuron. This is the one that's going to generate the output. Then there's going to be a synapse in the spinal integrating center between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron from the posterior and dorsal horn to the anterior ventral horn. Then the synapse is going to carry the output, and that's going to be an efferent motor neuron, and that's going to cause the effector, the quadricep muscle. The quadricep muscle, the femoris muscle is going to cause the reflex. They're going to extend. So many somatic reflexes involve muscle spindles. These are stretch receptors embedded in the skeletal muscle. They serve as proprioceptors. These are specialized sense organs to monitor the position and movement of the body part. So they serve as proprioceptors, specialized sense organs to monitor the position and movement of the body parts. They inform the brain of muscle length and body movement. They enable the brain to send motor commands back to the muscles that control the coordinated movement, and they perform corrective reflexes, muscle tone, and posture. So these are the muscle spindles. So you have alpha and gamma motor nerve fibers, and you have the connective tissue sheath that when it's cut open is going to expose for you the intrafusal fibers. The extrafusal fibers are outside of the nerve tissue. And then there are gamma motor fibers. So structure of the muscle spindle. The muscle spindle has intrafusal fibers. These are modified muscle fibers within the spindle. And the rest of the muscle fibers, those generating the force for movement, are known as the extrafusal fibers. There are gamma motor neurons that innervate the ends. They innervate the ends of an intrafusal fiber and keep it taut. What's taut? Verbally. Tight. Okay. So the mid portion of the interfusal fiber contains sensory nerve fibers. There are primary afferent fibers known as monitor fibers. These monitor the fiber length and the speed of the length changes. There are secondary afferent fibers, and these monitor the length only. There is a stretch mitotic reflex. The stretch mitotic reflex happens when a muscle is stretched and it fights back and then it contracts. It helps maintain equilibrium and posture. So the stretch mitotic reflex, when a muscle is stretched, it fights back and it contracts. It helps maintain the equilibrium and the posture. The head starts to tip forward as you fall asleep, and the muscles contract to raise the head. They stabilize the joints by balancing tension in extensors and flexors, smoothing the muscle actions. Stretch reflex is mediated primarily by the brain, but its spinal component can be more pronounced if the muscle is suddenly stretched by a tendon tap, known as the knee jerk. Stretch reflex. Stretch reflex is monosynaptic in the monosynaptic reflex arc. One synapse between the afferent and efferent neurons. There's a little synaptic delay, so there's a very prompt response. There's the patellar knee-jerk reflex, we talked about that, and then there is reciprocal inhibition. So the reflex phenomena that prevents the muscles from working against each other by inhibiting antagonist when the agonist is excited. So that shows you a tap on the patellar ligament excites the nerve endings of the muscle spindle. The stretch signals travel to the spinal cord dorsal root, the posterior end, via the primary afferent fiber and the dorsal root ganglia. The primary afferent neuron stimulates via primary afferent stimulates alpha motor neuron in the spinal cord. That's number 3, alpha motor neuron. The alpha motor neuron generating efferent signals in the alpha motor neuron nerve fiber that stimulate the quadriceps to contract, producing the knee jerk. But we are not done here. Also simultaneously, at the same time, a branch of the efferent nerve fiber stimulates inhibitory motor neuron in the spinal cord. That inhibitory motor neuron, that neuron inhibits the alpha motor neuron that supplies the hamstring muscles. The hamstring contraction is inhibited, so hamstrings, the knee flexors, do not antagonize the quadriceps from extending. So this very simple knee-jerk reflex is showing you what is being activated. But what's really happening, we have another arc that is showing us from here, number 5, at the same time. So at the same time, you have something that is being antagonized. This figure is incomplete because it's only showing you what is being agonized, what is being affected, and that is your quadriceps. But we need to show that in addition to the quadriceps contracting by the alpha motor nerve fibers stimulating the quadriceps to contract, we need the hamstring to relax. So at the same time, a branch of the afferent nerve fiber will stimulate the inhibitory motor neuron in the spinal cord. And that neuron inhibits the alpha motor neuron that supplies the hamstring muscles. So the hamstring contraction is inhibited, so the hamstrings or the knee flexors do not antagonize the quadriceps. So the flexor is known as the withdrawal reflex. The flexor, also known as the withdrawal reflex. The flexor reflex is the quick contraction of flexor muscles resulting in withdrawal of a limb from an injurious stimulus. So the flexor reflex is the quick contraction of the flexor muscles resulting in a withdrawal of a limb from an injurious stimulus. So that triggers the contraction of the flexors and the relaxation of the extensors in that limb. So that shows a polysynaptic reflex arc. That is the pathway in which the signals would travel over many synapses on their way to the muscles. Okay, this is the flexor and cross extension reflexes. You have number one, stepping on glass stimulates the pain receptors in the right foot. Number two, the sensory neuron activates multiple interneurons. Then there is ipsilateral. Motor neuron is going to send to the flexor, is going to be excited to flex. And then the ipsilateral flexor is going to contract. And then the contralateral motor neurons to the extensor is excited. And that's going to cause the contralateral extensor to contract. Okay. All right. Let's have a break and we'll meet again at 11 o'clock.